5:31. All board members, committee board members are present. Need approval of the agenda, please.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
The agenda is approved. Public comments, no public comments. So we move right to the budget planning timeline. Steve?
Thank you, Jack. So we're gonna end up kind of merging A, B, and C into a similar discussion. So when we met the last time, the Joint Finance Committee had approved a version of the budget that they were preparing to send to the state legislature for approval. Then the Legislative Fiscal Bureau created a report that said there's $4.4 billion of additional expected revenues available to the state of Wisconsin in the next state budget. The Joint Finance Committee then took that information and made changes to what it was that they were going to ask each of the houses to approve. In the school world, what that resulted in was 400+ million more being put into the state equalization aid formula. But what a lot of folks in the school community thought was also going to happen did not, which is the revenue limit formula. So the revenue limit formula remains at a $0 per student increase. And when that happens in the revenue limit formula, when there's additional funds going into the state equalization aid formula, it is not spendable to local school district. It impacts the property tax levy. The revenue limit formula is really, in the end, the two main sources of revenues are the state equalization aid and property taxes. And if you can't spend more and one number goes up, the other one goes down. Under the state equalization aid formula, there's some districts who receive more and some who receive less, and the numbers just work together to get to a total. So the Joint Finance Committee, the main reason why they were looking at putting that additional money into the equalization aid formula is because they were concerned that they might not meet the federal maintenance of effort requirements for Wisconsin to receive billions of federal dollars that would be available to be used by schools. So the concern was addressed by putting the additional funds into the equalization aid formula, but that did not result in school districts having any increase in expendable funds. So now we're in a situation where we were originally intending to ask you to look at a third draft of the budget tonight. In the previous meeting, we were originally intending to ask the HR committee of the board to look at recommending an approval on teacher compensation. Now what we're asking you to do is to let us see what the governor does to be able to put those pieces together for you, so that you're not being asked to make a major decision on something like pay increases without really knowing or seeing what the financial picture looks like. As we discussed with the HR committee, we remain committed to all of the planning that we have talked about this spring, approving pay increases before the first check of the year. All of that remains the same. We just want to be able to share with you what that picture looks like. Because if the revenue limit formula does not change, what we are going to recommend for the board to consider is to fully utilize the operational referendum funds, which is available to the board for a 5-year period of time. So basically what we were originally intending to do tonight, we're asking for some additional time. Our understanding is that the governor will be making some action later this week, if not really early next week. There is some schedule that he has to be following. The WCSD sent something out, I think it was yesterday, saying that they're expecting some action to occur later this week. So we'd like to table this discussion for maybe a week, maybe two, so that we can present all of this information together for you. We asked the HR committee at the previous meeting not to make a recommendation yet until we can actually show what that would look like. So the board has made decisions on other employee groups. We want to also make a decision on the teacher employee groups. The board has made decisions so far in some additional new positions, and we want to be able to the best of our ability, show you what that looks like. But as a background, in the event that the revenue limit is increase remains at zero, so if through the process with the governor, it remains at zero, we will be recommending the board to consider a budget that fully utilizes the operational referendum question from last November. We were talking a little bit during the HR committee meeting that you will be seeing this occur all across the state of Wisconsin, because school districts will not have the ability to spend funds operationally on anything, whether it's pay increases, bus contracts, utilities, because the revenue limit will be at zero. And so you will have school boards making decisions to go to the public for operational referendums to seek an ability to have operational funds, whether it's for cost of living, CPI increases, bus routes, utilities, additional positions, whatever it may be for. That's going to be very common in Wisconsin if the budget ends up being approved at zero. Now, there was some discussion about the governor vetoing the entire budget. That discussion does not appear to be on the front burner anymore because the legislature has said we're not coming back into session, and we've given you a budget that meets the federal maintenance of effort. And if this budget is not signed, then billions of dollars of federal aid are now at risk. So the governor knows that and is likely looking to see what potential might exist with line item vetoes to allow schools to spend some of the additional funding that has been allocated through the budget process. But at this point, we don't know if that's going to happen, or if it is going to happen, we don't know if that's through the revenue limit formula, the per pupil aid formula, or some other mechanism. So bringing forward a third draft of the budget at this point would include information that's not accurate until we can get a picture of what that looks like. So go ahead, Jack.
So then what we do is we reconvene in a week.
That was our thought, was that we would we'd recommend a special meeting that just has 2 agenda items, third draft of the budget, and then the supplemental pay for teachers, and tie that, and those would be the 2 items after we get a picture of what the governor does with the state budget.
Where are we on the new positions? You know, we approved those 6 or 9 positions. Are those hired, or?
The majority of them are hired or definitely in process. Brian, as far as the positions that we've approved, do you have any update on where we're at with those?
The additional positions that were part of that to help them, the ones related to student learning.
Right.
I believe that we hired our last of those positions. I think we finalized yesterday or today. Yesterday, perhaps finalized with that our last technology integrator.
Right.
And we've hired the rest.
But I think the other pieces.
Can you remind me the value of that? You know, how much?
I think those were about 700,000.
Yeah, because we approved the 3 technology positions.
Yep. Yeah. The other piece that we will receive, which we won't, as Steve talked about in the HR committee, is we will receive some dollars from the federal funds. We just don't know exactly what that's going to be. And after we submit our data towards the end of the summer, it'll be probably into the early fall before they actually sort that out to determine how that's distributed. So that's a piece that's a bit of an unknown as far as what we will receive, but those dollars are all, the recommendations that you approved for the positions you were just talking about, Jack, were all aligned to be appropriately sequenced to any of that federal dollar. So we can direct those dollars to that, which does help the scenario, but we don't know what those dollars are going to be.
Do we have an estimate? Because I think that kind of fluctuated between like $1.5 billion.
Fluctuated it quite a bit, and then when they shifted it to a formula based on percentage of being open, that's where we've kind of lost the ability to really determine, because they're going to have to wait till everybody submits that district statewide, and then they'll distribute it out based on the information they get.
Will it be distributed through the state, or will it be distributed by the feds?
The feds give the money to the state, and then the state determines, and that's part of the issue, is that the state has determined their own method of distributing it, of which they have a data gathering piece, which we have to do before the end of August. And then from there, they will look at how that looks across the state, and then they'll distribute it.
And something else that's new since we met last about the federal funding. So there's the terms that are being used are called ESSER 1, ESSER 2, and ESSER 3. I know that doesn't really make sense to a lot of people, but ESSER 1 was a very small dollar amount, somewhere in the low 60s, that we used for some Chromebooks for students to be able to learn through the pandemic from home to support student learning. ESSER 2 was the one that was signed by President Trump around, I think, I'm trying to remember where that was, maybe late December, mid-December.
Right.
That one is the one, Jack, you're referring to, that had a range of, we could have been up to 1.5 million. There is a base allocation for our district that's in the mid 200s. And then, as Randy said, the Joint Finance Committee came up with a process that if a district did not receive a minimum threshold of funding, which we were in, DeForest is in, there's a certain number of districts in the state that are in this group of schools that did not receive significant funds from ESSER 2. We are all reporting in-person hours, and those in-person hours are being used to then calculate back what we're going to receive. But the biggest source of federal funding is ESSER 3. So that's the one that President Biden signed. For ESSER 3, the Joint Finance Committee came up with a 50% requirement for in-person hours in a school year to be reported in conjunction with your virtual hours. We were initially hoping that maybe we might be able to look at elementary school to see throughout the entire school year if that would have been possible. Tim Schell dove into the specifics of that and believes that it is a district-wide threshold, that you'd have to look at it, and he found some language in there that definitely makes it look like it's district-wide. So the DPI, the hours that they're collecting for ESSER 2, they're now going to use those for ESSER 3, but we have not yet seen what our, you want to call it, our minimum level would be under ESSER 3, but we know we have funds coming in under ESSER 2. We will have some funds coming in under ESSER 3. And as Randy said, we can take the positions that are based on improving student learning, math, reading, et cetera, that were approved, and they are completely appropriate uses and what it's intended for of the federal funding. Typical operational expenditures are not appropriate to be used for federal funding and cannot be. Things like bus contracts, utilities, cost of living increases, that type of discussion. So yes, Jack, we will have somewhere in that range. As everyone knows, our in-person hours are going to be different than the Kaukanas and Ninas and
Right.
other districts that are in the same situation. So,
Mark, you got a question?
So, big picture. Some ESSER funds maybe. Operational referendum. And I don't think I heard a third option. Would those combined revenues balance out what we have, or is that still going to pretty much put us behind what we need to make our projected budget for third draft?
yeah, that's a great question. So when an operational referendum is approved by the public, so like it was last November, the decision to utilize the funds is then a board decision for the period of time that you ask the question, whether it's 3 years or 5 years, if it's permanent or whatever it ends up being. So it is going to be a board decision if you utilize the $2.1 million. And the thing to just note with the revenue limit formula, the revenue limit formula calculates out a dollar amount for your operational budget. A referendum to exceed the cap of, let's say, 2.1 million is just simply added in. So instead of it being like 40, it's 42. And then you have $42 million available for operational expenses. So when we first looked at this referendum last November, we knew we were going to have challenges in the first year operationally related to COVID expenditures, school reopening, bus routes, et cetera. And we did get some questions from members of the public like, well, what will this look like in year 2? What will this look like in year 3? And the answer that we gave members of the public is the board will make that decision when we get to that point, because we are asking for a 5-year referendum question. And as an example, if the state budget provided significant amounts of money, you as a board might have said, we don't feel we need to utilize those funds. But it's going to be a decision for the 7 board members to say, do we want to utilize those operational referendum funds?
So we've got 700,000 committed to the 6 or 9 employees. Remind me what we were planning on raises.
It's in the million, right around $1 million. It's a good example.
So it's 1.7 million that we've already committed. And to your point, you know, we've got energy costs going up. We've got
Well, my bigger question, or my follow-up question was, with the uncertainty, at some point, and maybe be a week from now, do we need to consider looking at all items in the budget and saying, okay, we're short 45% of revenues because of the state decision-making. All budgets get hit 45% versus saying one versus the other. I mean, I'm a little concerned. Maintenance, we've got 2 trucks that we're looking to order. And I would just hope that the money being targeted for the new school year hasn't already been spent, but I'm guessing some of it already has. And it would seem to me that we need to make sure that all budgets are somehow affected equally.
Yeah, and Mark, just to make you feel a little better about that, there are a lot of options available. As an example, the final allocations that would be in the high school budget, the middle school budget. Another example is a budget committee. We talked about, do we make the payment to the Fund 73 trust or don't we?
Right.
Right. It's a nice thing to do, but it's not a required thing to do. That's basically almost $500,000, right? So there are absolutely options available for us to review with the budget committee and for you as board members to make, including going back and taking a look at budgets that traditionally have carried forward the same dollar amount. And so, yes, that definitely is, but you're right, Jack, those are the two big commitments at this point that would total up to roughly that, which are under, of course, the $2.1 million that the board is authorized to approve when the budget is finally approved in October.
So I think if we're gonna come back here in a week, I think what I'd like to see is what, out of that 2 million, what have we committed? We've basically talked about two big chunks, but what are the other increases? You know, obviously, we've got transportation that goes up on an annual basis, we got fuel, we got, you know, just determine how far off are we? You know, so if we sit here and say, okay, it's 2.1 million we've got to spend, how far away are we on the 2.1 million? And then we can sit down and figure out whether we're going to make the payments and different things like that. So that's what I would like to see, you know, at our next meeting.
Yeah, we appreciate that, Jack. That's a great point, and that we'd love to be able to do that. And the only, I would say there's two missing pieces. One, we will know, which is what the governor does. And the one that's going to be still hanging out there a little bit is the federal ESSER 2 and ESSER 3. But we can share with you what would be some examples of positions that can move over to ESSER 2 with what we know that we have available. And that's our intent with tabling this, is we don't want to present you with information that in a week is not accurate.
I would leave the ESSER 3 money as kind of windfall. You know, forget it, because we don't know exactly how much, and it may be so insignificant because we don't have the hours in class. Right, speaking coach's voice. But, you know, I think that's what we have to do. Use the ESSER 3 as a windfall.
And then there were, of course, some other things on the agenda that I was hoping for some feedback on that would help us craft that final version of the budget. But in general, between the timeline, the legislative update, and the review and the discussion that we just had with the HR committee on salary increases, our request would be at the board meeting next Monday for us to have a meeting. It's not going to have to be a super long meeting, but it could be really focused on this topic, so that Rainey and I and Brian have talked about having the whole board there, just having a special meeting. Everybody can hear it, everybody can see it, and be able to understand where we're at with whatever it is that the governor does or doesn't do.
And you say the governor is supposed to do something this week or within the next 2 weeks?
That's our understanding. The WASB WASB put something out today with or yesterday saying that they expect it by the end of this week or maybe early next week, but soon.
Yeah, I think once it lands on his desk, he has 6 to 8 days to really respond to it. Otherwise, I think it kind of moves forward from there. So I think it's expected in the next few days. But I think once we see it, we want to give Steve a little bit of time to then translate that into what it means for us, so that we can bring it back.
So we've covered this. We move on?
Yep, if you wouldn't mind, Rebecca, moving down on the. Okay, so thank you. So the topic in front of you is the Fund 41 dialogue. The budget committee requested that administration come back with an example of what this would look like if we ended up changing our strategy. Rebecca, if you wouldn't mind pulling up the board policy, the one that's in Word, that one, yep. So back when we had the operational referendum in on November 4th of 2014, so we're going back in time a little bit here, the board asked the public for operational funding for maintenance and technology. One of the concerns that the school board that was in place in that time frame was very concerned about making sure that as time went on, those funds remained in the maintenance budget and the technology budget, So the board passed a policy that basically said the maintenance funds from this operational referendum are going to be deposited into Fund 41, and the technology funds are going to be deposited into the technology budget in Fund 10. A way for the current board to address the concern identified by Moody's would be a start to that would be to look at this policy and say, we're still committed to the allocations for maintenance and technology. We are not changing what the board in 2014 was trying to accomplish, but we're moving the funds for the maintenance to Fund 10, not Fund 41. So the concept that we're discussing here would result in the Fund 10 fund balance being the balance where we keep maintenance funds, as opposed to Fund 41, in response to Moody's stating that they do not look at Fund 41 in their evaluation of a district's credit score. They determine those funds not to be relevant. Now, we did include which you don't have to pull it up, Rebecca, but we did include in the board packet some supporting materials to show the fund balances of Fund 10 and Fund 41 over time, to show that overall, the district's financial health is very strong, has been and continues to be. It's just that we followed through with a long-standing plan to have funds in both Fund 10 and Fund 41. Rebecca, if you go ahead, Jack.
I guess just looking at this, just to make it clear, with any unspent funds in either maintenance or technology, they would go back into their respective accounts.
Oh, sure.
Right.
You know,
Yep.
just to,
You want to clarify that they're going to go into the maintenance and tech fund, and that the carryover would go into maintenance and tech.
that's correct.
Okay, yep, thank you for that feedback. We can definitely do that. So that's the policy end of it. Then in conjunction with that, what would happen on the budget end? Rebecca, if you wouldn't mind going back to the budget piece. If you could pull up the third draft Fund 41 for just a moment. And if you could go to the last page on this. So what would end up happening in Fund 41 if we move forward with this is we would levy the funds that the board was levying in Fund 41 in Fund 10. So the 509,000 that we have been levying to move into Fund 41, we move it into Fund 10. Now we still have funds remaining in Fund 41. They have to remain in Fund 41. So what makes sense is for the board to continue approving maintenance projects out of Fund 41. So the net effect of that is we're going to be saving money in Fund 10 that we're not spending because we're spending the maintenance funds in Fund 41. That will increase the Fund 10 fund balance, which will address one of the two topics that Moody's help address one of the two topics that they brought up. So it will, in effect, reverse what we had done, where we had still a similar fund balance. It just was split between two funds. As time would go on, it would go back to one fund, which would cause a credit rating agency like Moody's to say, that's a good fund balance in Fund 10. So in effect, it would just reverse that process, but we would spend the funds in Fund 41 on capital maintenance. So the board approved projects. So the facility committee has already reviewed projects for next year, has already approved projects for next year. Those projects would remain in Fund 41. We would use the funds that remain there to pay for the projects, while again, building up the Fund 10 fund balance, because we're gonna move the property tax levy. Now that's an annual meeting topic. The annual meeting has to approve tax levy going into Fund 41. I would need to work with our attorney to find out if you actually have to ask the public to reverse that. Because the public needs to give you the authority to do it. I'm not sure if they have to give you the approval to not do it. That doesn't seem like that would need to be the case, but I would want to ask the question just to make sure.
So what is the balance in Fund 41?
So I'm estimating it to be around 1.2 million at the end of this fiscal year.
Okay.
The two major,
Not counting the 509,000, right?
no, including the 509,000,
Okay.
because that would include our commitment to the soccer stadium and the projects, the maintenance projects that were approved by the board for the past fiscal year.
Okay.
And we took out all of the HVAC and plumbing work related to COVID and put it into Fund 10 as a part of the additional 2.1 million. So funds will remain for the board probably for 3 years to draw down for maintenance projects as approved by the facility committee, probably for a 3-year period of time, while we're building all of that up in Fund 10.
Okay.
So this is a strategy, if you would like, the draft of the budget that we bring back when we do the third draft of the budget can include this, or it can keep including what we've been doing in the past. This was just being presented to you as a visual of what this would look like if you wanted to consider a strategy like this for, you know, basically building up our Fund 10 fund balance while spending down Fund 41.
I would suggest we do it. Put it in the third draft or the fourth or the fifth draft of the budget, whichever. They're on right now.
Yeah,
So
seems,
I think you'd want a motion on that policy then,
Yep.
Steve, and with the additions and the corrections that Jack.
For etiquette, does that policy piece have to go through policy first or not?
I don't think it does. I guess from a timing standpoint, I'd move it forward to the board right from here.
Okay.
And just explain that that was part of the budget planning and it's part of our third draft. So then we're consistent. So I just move it right to the board from
Okay.
here. But I think the board, this committee should recommend it to the boards per the
I
language.
move we move the new policy language to the full board.
second,
with the corrections,
With the corrections, correct.
all in favor?
I,
It's fast.
Okay, thank you. So we will modify the draft to include that version. Whenever you get a chance, Rebecca, if you could just scroll to the next topic. The next two items are just informational. These are follow-up from the last budget committee meeting. Joan, you had asked a question on the Fund 73 fund balance and how much of that overall fund balance is in the account that is in individuals' names for the HRA health reimbursement account post-retirement benefit versus how much is in the other account, which is in the district's name, which is not committed to any individual, and that's 1.7 million. So one of the takeaways to just keep in mind with the Fund 73 discussion is we do have $1.7 million in Fund 73 that is required to remain there, but you're not required to keep adding to it. So in the event that there is a fiscal challenge that the board is presented with, like potentially a revenue limit increase of 0, you would have the ability to say, we're going to leave the 1.7 million in there for now. We're not going to kick in an additional almost $500,000 based on where the overall financial situation is, and you can look at it again later. Overall, we've made significant accomplishments in Fund 73 over the last decade. We had $0 in any post-employment benefit trust fund back when we negotiated this with the teachers union. We were one of the first districts in the state to actually reach an agreement with our teachers union to move forward with a post-employment plan that we would fund. So this has been a very significant positive situation that over the last 10 plus years, where we're at today. We have continuously funded it every year, but it's just important to keep in mind, if finances become strained or difficult, you don't have to do it every year. So I think that's maybe why you wanted to see that. Any questions at all about that information that was requested? Okay, thank you. And then the last topic is, Jack, you had asked for information on where we are at with staff development expenditures. One interesting thing that I learned when I dove into this, there was a couple of reports that we were able to pull from our financial system. The district expenditure for staff development is quite low. When you, Rebecca, if you want to pull up the curriculum staff development, this is the budget that has historically been managed by Tim. You would see that that budget is only $16,986. And when you go way back in time, when we had a gentleman named Mike Hensgen managing the curriculum department, there was a rotating schedule when teachers would be able to access staff development funds to go to something. And I think the number was like $10,000 or $11,000 or something like that. So it remains fairly low on the, let's say, the district office side of things. But if you could pull up the other one, Rebecca, for just a moment. On the grant side of things is where, that one right there, please. If you just go to the last page.
So where did these grants come from?
So the grants that you see here, and if you could just show a little bit further down, Rebecca, the total. So we have, is that, yeah, 222 out of 222,000 out of our federal grants is allocated towards staff development. Examples of that, Jack, are Title II, which is intended for a lot of staff development expenditures. Title III, which is for ELL students. Title I, which is typically for reading support, and then flow through funding for special education support. You can see that the majority of our expenditures for staff development are actually coming from grants, not the district budget. So when new staff development initiatives come up, it's why Tim Shell has historically said to the buildings, I'm going to need your help if we're going to spend $40,000 on some, whatever the topic may be, because he's looking at the $16,000 that he has available under the district budget. And of course, some of the, costs are of course applicable to federal grants, but that's why in the past, there's been a lot of partnering between Tim's office and the school's budgets to try to put together some of these larger expenditure items. You raised the question, why not just move the money into the district budget in the first place so that it's there to be able to do these initiatives? That's a very good question. So you can see the totals that were expended during the pandemic year. They're certainly much higher during non-pandemic years. But I did also learn during this process, we've got to come up with a consistent method for accounting for these expenditures across our school buildings, whether it's through Tim's office and Amy's office so you can see the total, or whether we do it differently. But basically that's the information that we have for the past year on staff development.
So, excuse me, the something like PLC or some of the other initiatives for social, emotional behavior training, would those probably be a combination of the building and the curriculum budget? Or will some of those actually go through the grants as well?
That's a good question. So for for special education, obviously managed by Kurt in the past, in order for him to be able to have special ed teachers attend, he would have to tap into his federal funds because he doesn't really have, we didn't have in the special ed department,
Sure.
a budget for him to tap into. So for special ed staff, it was always looked at out of the federal grant when we could do it. Then the remainder would have been Tim looking at, or Amy looking at what's available through their grants or their budget, and then partnering with the schools.
Okay.
And they always would typically come up with, can you contribute $100 per staff member or something like that, so we can put this whole thing together.
Perfect,
It's
thank you.
usually a combination of all of the above. And you saw some things come out like post-COVID, the county put forth grants to schools to kind of deal just with issues that they're seeing with students. And I mean, Chris Mann put in for that, that's $50-some thousand. That's completely geared towards professional development. So usually when we have something that comes out like PLC or some of those things, it's a matter of looking at how can we be as effective with those dollars across. But it's also then taking a look at giving some local control to the building to determine like how are they going to allocate some dollars to train some of their strategic staff to bring those things back. That's how PLC came. So PLC has been a combination of the board allocating. If you remember, we allocated $75,000 at the board table, and then that was supplemented over the years by the buildings, the grants, and so.
So why would you put it all in a training budget, PLC, because then, basically what you're going to say is we need X number, we need so many dollars for PLC, or whatever other initiatives, and then it's all in one place as opposed to there's some here, there's some here, there's some there.
And I think it just comes down to, as Steve said, many of them are held, all those federal dollars are held in district office. That's run by the administrators that are out here. So that is relatively central. But those are run by specific budget managers for those grants. The other dollars, I think it's kind of a philosophy we've had with regards to having some local control within the buildings as far as how they allocate funds. And that's part of, I think, where that has come from. Also, as they start to see specific needs within a building, they can identify someone to go to that, and they have dollars and some control over it. That's generally, I think, why we've done it that way. I mean, it is a piece, as we've been looking the last few years, of what are some of the things, because we have like curriculum dollars that are tied into building budgets as well, as opposed to all being centralized out in Tim's areas. That's a piece that we have identified as wanting to review. It's kind of the same piece as making sure that our coding is the same so we can pull it out. So I think that one to me makes a little bit more sense than pulling all the dollars from the professional development out, because I do want to leave some ability of our principals to make some decisions within their budget to allocate towards some staff needs. And it's not just staff of the teaching staff, it could be their paras, their office staff, or themselves as well.
Randy or Steve, the numbers that you've listed here for the different buildings, athletics, and technology, are those numbers that just in this last school year were utilized for training or for staff development?
Yes, that's correct.
So this isn't necessarily a budgeted item for those buildings. It just happened to be the use for that year.
That's correct, yes.
So they have a total budget, and within that total budget, they can allocate it for whatever they choose. And that's why we see varying numbers like high school at 25. They just, from their whole budget, that this is just what they use this year. So it really isn't budgeted for staff development necessarily.
No, I think
that's correct.
I think that's accurate. Yeah, I think that there is some room within their budget that as we start looking at some of these options, as opposed to carrying some of the dollars over for other purposes, they do gear towards some of this work.
And one thing just to add, Joan, like the high school has access to like Carl Perkins funds,
Right.
to do staff development for a variety of different departments. And so each building also there's different federal funding that may or may not be available depending on their grade level. So like at the elementary school, there's not something like Carl Perkins available to them. So you do see a wider variety, but yes, and these numbers would be much larger in a normal year.
Correct.
So these are just in the
Right.
pandemic year.
And it is all based on the coding you found,
Yeah.
then,
Well, we actually went through we picked them out.
wow.
But when you look at like a PLC piece, and you have buildings that have had more turnover with retirements, and then you had a principal say, you know what, I really want to send 10 people there. So I'm going to allocate some of my dollars because I think that's a value and do that. So that's kind of where to Jack's question, why we've allowed for some of the flexibility within the buildings to be able to address some of their specific needs. And then as we have like district level initiatives, that's definitely one that we have to look at more specifically to make sure we have the dollars to support it equally across the district.
Well, PLC is a district initiative, so that should be in a Tim Shell budget, and that's probably the bulk of your training. I don't know for a fact.
You know, like this, the last few summers, we did adaptive schools, which was a complement to PLC tests. It's how do you run meetings? How do you work with people? That's been a piece that again has been funded through multiple different revenue sources, part of which was strategic from the buildings as far as who they felt needed that training. And then others have been definitely funded through many of them are through the grants.
And I like the flexibility this system provides because we're hiring extremely competent building principals to have a pulse of their building and to address the needs within that specific building. Not every year you're going to have the same needs. I know from just being aware of it, the PLC Foundation actually began before it became a district initiative because I know the high school and the intermediate school were exploring it on a small scale basis. And from there, it emerged into a district-wide thing. And so to have that flexibility to address specific needs, I mean, we can look at one of the elementary schools that was dealing with some challenging behavioral things a couple of years ago. It might benefit them to have some resources to deal with that they shouldn't have to go to the district for. They have access to their own budget where they can address that need.
When you look at our whole budget, the amount of budget authority our principals have is very little. They have no budget authority over the dollars as far as anything that's, 82% of our costs are people. They have no say over that. So they have basically supply budgets and some dollars for these type of things. So as far as helping to move instruction within their building, this is the one place they have a little bit of flexibility to make some decisions.
Okay. Any other comments, concerns? Items we need to cover? Motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you for your time.
Yep. Thanks, Brian. You still there?
Yeah, I am.
All right. I don't think you're coming to facility.